I am thrilled to be introducing Dr. Anna Volkmer, who will be very kindly telling us today about her work in better conversations with people with primary progressive aphasia. And excuse me, just one second. I am very happy to share that Dr. Volkmer is an associate professor and consultant speech language therapist at University College London in the UK. And Anna has been working as a speech and language therapist for almost 25 years and specializes in developing interventions for people with dementia and their families. She also leads the International Speech Language Therapist / Pathologist, PPA network, and very excitingly is co-convening the first international conference on PPA in London later this year. So please help me welcome Dr. Volkmer.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction, Sharon. But I also want to emphasize that Sharon is doing a platform presentation at our conference in London, which is why it's also particularly exciting. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So let me just slowly scroll through to the start of my slides. So here we've got the first proper slide from my slides, and I'm going to talk to you about the work we've done to co-develop and trial better conversations with primary progressive aphasia. And I will just acknowledge all the lovely people who've helped me on this journey. I actually thought it would be really helpful to tell you a little bit about my background and why I do research. So I trained as a speech and language therapist, we call ourselves in England, in London, which is where I grew up. So I went to university here and I did a degree in speech and language therapy, and then I worked clinically in London. And at some point I thought maybe I should leave London. So I have actually sorry, this is the university I studied at, but I actually travelled quite far. I travelled over to Australia, and I worked in Australia for 5 years as a clinical speech and language therapist. And it was actually in Australia. I was working in a city called Melbourne, which is in a state called Victoria, which is quite a mixed state. There's a lot of regional areas, but I was working in an urban area, and we were starting to get referrals for people with primary progressive aphasia. Bearing in mind, I had been working, when I trained as a speech therapist, I started working with adults with acquired communication disorders. I worked with people with stroke aphasia and brain injuries. And I was working in this clinic, and we were starting to get referrals for people with this slightly different presentation of a progressive aphasia. And the reason we were getting these referrals was because speech therapists working in more regional areas were saying, we don't know what to do with them. Given you're working in quite an urban environment, surely you must know. And we started doing some speech therapy. At the time, it was the mid-2000s, and there wasn't really much research evidence out there at all. So we started doing a little bit of therapy work with them quite successfully. At this time, this kind of coincided with my decision to return back to the UK. And I thought, well, I'm coming back to London. It can't just be in Australia that we're seeing people with primary progressive aphasia. I wonder what they're doing, what other therapists are doing in London. And when I came back, I actually found very little going on in this world of primary progressive aphasia. Hardly any speech therapists were seeing people with PPA. And I did start to build a clinical caseload of these clients because I started telling people that I was working with people with primary progressive aphasia, yet there wasn't much research developing. And I suddenly had this idea that maybe I needed to do some of this research. So 15 years after I left university, I actually returned to University College London and started a research career. So I kind of call myself a clinical academic. I still work half a day in our National Health Service, helping diagnose people with different dementia types. And the rest of the time, I do research, developing interventions to try and increase our clinical capacity by developing some of that research. So I'm going to tell you about the research, but I always think it's quite useful to define dementia and primary progressive aphasia before I do that, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. And I'm sure you're all aware that dementia is an umbrella term. I often describe it as an umbrella term for a group of progressive neurological diseases that result in progressive cognitive impairment over time. And two of the most common types, in fact, the most common type of dementia, is caused by an Alzheimer's pathology. So typical Alzheimer's disease is a memory-led condition. Frontotemporal dementia is also one of the main types of dementia, but this is associated far more with a range of tau proteins in the brain. And it's these amyloid and tau proteins that cause a progressive deterioration of brain tissue. And depending on where that protein affects the brain, this kind of dictates the syndromic presentation that we see. And in typical Alzheimer's disease, that presentation is a memory-led disease. Whilst in logopenic variant PPA, we see people presenting with a language-led dementia. So logopenic variant primary progressive aphasia is associated with an underlying Alzheimer's pathology. However, non-fluent variant PPA and semantic variant PPA are associated with underlying frontotemporal dementia pathologies. So if this wasn't complicated enough, it's actually there's more to it. These diseases, whilst logopenic, non-fluent, and semantic variant PPAs are all in the same family because these are language-led dementias, they're also overlapping with several other syndromes, such as progressive supranuclear palsy, corticobasal syndromes, and many of these syndromes we often see people over time. They may start with a language-led syndrome, but as the disease evolves, we start seeing symptoms that we associate with these other syndromes. It is appearing as part of their disease process. And I think this can often mean that progressive aphasia seem much more complex. And indeed they are, partly perhaps actually not because of all the associated syndromes, but because we cannot often predict what will happen for people as the disease progresses. Now, to add to this complexity, I've presented the terminology that we use. So this is based on the Gorno-Tempini international criteria, but there's other terminology often used to describe these progressive aphasias. Phrases like dynamic aphasia, progressive dysprosodia, primary progressive apraxia of speech, progressive pure word deafness. So you may have heard of all these terms, but I'm going to be sticking with the three primary progressive aphasias to really describe the people that I'm working with. And the reason I think primary progressive aphasia is so important is actually because although the three primary progressive aphasias are a rarer dementia group in many ways, we know that people with lots of different dementia types experience secondary progressive aphasia. And it's really quite typical that we see people with typical Alzheimer's and posterior cortical atrophy, the visual-led dementias, experiencing secondary progressive aphasia that looks a lot like logopenic. And we often see people with with behavioural variant experiencing secondary aphasia that looks a lot like non-fluent. The reason this is important is that all the therapy interventions that we're developing and co-producing with people with primary progressive aphasia have a much wider potential application to people with all different types of dementia. And and I will use the stats from the UK, partly because it's very straightforward, that we estimate there's approximately 1 million people in the UK who have dementia. Whilst we think there's probably a conservative estimate is that there's around 6,000 people in the UK with PPA, what we know about PPA could apply to this entire million people with dementia, potentially, in terms of the interventions. Okay, so upscaling what we know about PPA can have a much wider impact therapeutically. So let me tell you just quickly about the 3 types of PPA. I hope this is a helpful revision for those of you who already know all this. But as I mentioned, primary progressive aphasia describes this group of language-led dementias. So the main diagnostic factor is that people should be presenting with speech and language difficulties as the first and leading main symptom. Now, if those symptoms are characterized by dyspraxia, so effortful or misarticulated speech, it's very likely they're presenting with a non-fluent variant of PPA. If they're presenting with an apraxia, they're not presenting with an apraxia, but they're presenting with an agrammatism, so omitting some of the perhaps prepositional words or even determiners. It's more, they're perhaps just using quite telegraphic speech. It's more likely that they're presenting with a non-fluent again. If all of that is okay, but they have problems with word repetition and word recall, retrieval, they're probably presenting with a logopenic variant. That's the blue variant associated with Alzheimer's pathology. If all of that is okay, but they're having real difficulties with word meanings, then they're most likely presenting with a semantic variant PPA. Having said all that, we're all humans. We're not square pegs that fit into square holes. And we know that there's perhaps up to between 15 and 40% of people with primary progressive aphasia don't fit these descriptions perfectly, but perhaps have more of an atypical or mixed presentation. So there we have it. This is what I'm talking about. This is primary progressive aphasia. And the thing is that the main problem with primary progressive aphasia is that language and communication is difficult. And we know that speech and language therapy is the main treatment for these difficulties. There is no current cure for primary progressive aphasia. Speech and language therapy is the main intervention. However, while I was working clinically, up until I started my research career, I hadn't really found much research that was on anything beyond single words. Most of the research up till that point had been demonstrating that if people with PPA practice single word retrieval, that was useful. But actually, people with PPA and their family members weren't saying to me, I'd like to say 20 words or 10 words, or I'd like to be able to say nouns. What they would say is, I want to have a conversation with my wife. I want to be able to communicate with my grandchildren. And I suddenly realized maybe this was something I could help with. And that's what's inspired me to develop what we call the Better Conversations with Primary Progressive Aphasia intervention that I'm going to explain today. So before I embarked on actually just inventing an intervention for people, I wanted to know what interventions were already out there beyond single words and what was common about these interventions. And you can describe interventions like this as perhaps compensatory or activity-based interventions that focused on people's ability to participate in activities of everyday living in terms of communication. Well, I conducted a systematic review and I identified at the time 19 studies that had been written about compensatory interventions. None of these described conversation therapies as I knew them. But what they all had in common was that they focused on enhancing strategies that people had already started developing in their conversations and their lives. And all of these interventions involved a person and another person around them, a key conversation partner or a communication partner. So I knew that these were 2 core ingredients that we needed to integrate into any new intervention that we developed. I was doing this work on conversation and I suddenly thought, hold on, maybe I'm the only speech therapist doing this out there. So the other thing I needed to do in order to inform the intervention I wanted to develop is check that I wasn't going out on a limb. So I surveyed speech and language therapists around the UK, which is the context in which I was working in our national health system. And along the bottom, you can see the different types of intervention. I asked them what they used always and often. And what you can see here In pink is what speech therapists said they never or occasionally use, so the pink and the mauve. And this described all those impairment-focused word retrieval interventions. They rarely used those. In reality, what people described always and often doing were communication training interventions, yet they reported that they weren't using ones designed for people with PPA. They're actually borrowing from the stroke aphasia and the brain injury literature to do this. The problem was that these interventions were designed for a different disease trajectory. We know that primary progressive aphasia is a progressive disease trajectory, whereas people with stroke aphasia and brain injury have ideally, we're hoping for, but generally they're in an upwards and, maintenance trajectory. Okay. But I knew there were some core ingredients that were already being used and potentially working. And many of the UK speech and language therapists were reporting using this intervention called Better Conversations with Stroke Aphasia. So I went back to UCL where I trained, which is where Better Conversations with Stroke Aphasia was developed originally. And I developed Better Conversations with Primary Progressive Aphasia. And we now host that on our UCL website, behind a locked wall for trained speech therapists, but we have those materials available. And I will say, I didn't just develop it out of thin air. I actually thought, well, I can't do this on my own. I need to ask people with lived experience. So as I mentioned, I did examine the research literature and I used that to inform the first draft. But I also actually asked people living with primary progressive aphasia and their family members to co-design the handouts, the logo, the content of the session plans to structure these with me. And I also looked at what the speech therapists were telling me about the amount of time they had available to deliver these types of interventions. And having developed a first draft, I actually went back to the speech and language therapists to ask them what the key consensus components needed to be that needed to stay. And then I also did some focus groups with people with primary progressive aphasia to gather more data about how those conversations were affected in people's everyday lives and what they wanted in terms of their conversations, and actually also this progressive disease trajectory. And we used that to refine our intervention and pilot it. So I'm going to just give you an overview of that intervention. So we developed this intervention to be delivered over 4 sessions, 4 one-hour sessions, because that's what speech therapists reported in the UK having available if they had time to deliver this. And we developed session plans and handouts for each of these 4 sessions. So the therapy, just to give you an idea, having made a video recording of a person already, having a conversation with a key conversation partner, we then sat down with that dyad, that pair of people, and we talked to them about how conversation works. So this is informed by conversation analysis, science, and behavior change theory. So we were equipping them with the tools to be able to analyze their own videos. So then we use clips of their own conversations and we show them 2 or 3 clips, and we support that dyad to actually analyze their own videos. We don't analyze them for them. We facilitate those discussions. We coach people through their own video analysis to identify the things that they feel are barriers or facilitators in their conversations. And then we practice those. We set goals and we practice those strategies they've identified and set goals around. And then we identify problems with those, we refine them, and then we think about the future. And just to give you an example, it's really common that when we show someone a video recording of themselves having a conversation, they don't realize how effective their gestures can be in the context of a word finding difficulty. I'm sure many of you have seen this, when someone has aphasia and they have a word finding difficulty, they might perhaps gesture or try to gesture the meaning. And we often find that family members feel they must correct or give that person the word and make sure that person then says the target word. Well, this isn't really what happens in typical conversations when someone doesn't have a communication difficulty. In fact, in typical conversations, we often just make sure the other person understands what we mean and we maintain the conversational flow. So we often find when we show people video clips, actually going through this kind of learning sequence can be a real barrier to conversation. And actually, the person often doesn't realize how effective their gestures are. So we often set goals around using more gestures and avoiding these kind of correction sequences, just to allow conversations to flow and maintain people's relationships as husband and wives. So this intervention is informed by applied conversation analysis. That allows us to drill down into these specific behaviors that allow people to do that without focusing too much only on their relationships, because we know that that's important, but equally to actually drill down to the conversation behaviors, we need to have these examples of their videos and give them the tools to be able to describe and set goals around those behaviors. We also know from behavior change theory that the use of video recordings is extremely powerful. Seeing the impact that you have on another person is extremely powerful. We know that setting goals on what behaviors, so setting goals, for example, saying what you're going to do instead of something is also really important. Saying you're just going to say, stop asking a certain type of question is really hard, or stop a behavior, like stop doing something, is really hard. It's much easier to say, I'm going to do X instead of Y. So using behavior change theory and then self-management theory as well to help people practice into the future. So we trialed this intervention across with 18 dyads across 4 national health service. We actually trialed it across 6, but in the end, due to COVID, we recruited people mainly across 4 NHS organisations, National Health Service organisations. And our first pilot trial, the aim was to see if we could deliver a randomised controlled trial. We were comparing this intervention to no treatment, a waiting list control, because we didn't have a comparable treatment. So we wanted to see if we could deliver this randomized controlled trial, and we wanted to see if the therapists could be trained to deliver the therapy as intended. Could they maintain fidelity to the intervention? We wanted to know if people found the intervention acceptable. The people with PPA and their family members, did they hate it? What was the point in delivering this intervention if they were going to hate it? And we needed to know what to measure for a future full study. So to shortcut you to the results, treatment fidelity was high. We achieved over 90% fidelity. So we knew that we could train speech therapists to deliver as intended. We recruited 18 couples to the intervention. As with much research, COVID, it really interrupted our research. But even preceding COVID, in the UK, we had some government changes that put some staffing pressures. So it was tricky to actually recruit people. But actually, everybody who started the intervention finished the intervention, and they all rated the intervention very positively. We had some difficulties. Some people found it hard to identify a partner to do the intervention with us, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We found that the couples, the dyads who did participate in the study, when we compared their goals, so they all rated their goals as achieved. They set goals and they either achieved or overachieved 29 out of 30 goals across that group. And when we compared the goals they were setting to we recorded them having conversations before therapy, and then we recorded them having conversations after therapy, and then we had masked raters code those videos for the target behaviors that they'd wanted to change. And so we coded those behaviors and counted them. And what we saw is that there was an increase in the behaviors that people were trying to do more of, and there was a decrease in the behaviors they were trying to do less of. So the conversation behaviors that people were targeting, they didn't just feel they changed, they actually objectively changed on video recordings. And we used a measure called the Aphasia Impact Questionnaire, and we did indeed see improvements in quality of life according to that measure, and they did go in the intended direction. The thing was, people told us, you're still not quite measuring what we're getting out of this. We're getting much more out of this than just a bit of improvement in quality of life. It's changing our relationships, our connections, our confidence. And these measures are designed for people with so the aphasia impact questionnaire we were using, it was designed for people with stroke aphasia, not for a progressive trajectory. So we still had questions around how best to measure the impact of this intervention. And we still had questions about the number of sessions, because some people said, gosh, we didn't need 4, we could have done this in 2. And others said, oh, a little bit more practice would have been useful. We also realised that some people were having trouble identifying partners. And actually, what I didn't mention when I talked about primary progressive aphasia is that primary progressive aphasia is often something identified in younger people compared to what you might think of in typical Alzheimer's. So many of the people who were recruiting to this study were in their 60s and late 50s, often still working. Their partners were still working. And so many partners couldn't participate because they had to go to work or they had families they had to look after. So it wasn't just that there wasn't a partner. It was often more that that partner couldn't be released from their other commitments to come to a therapy setting to do this activity. So people told us, actually, if we could access this remotely via Zoom, or video conferencing of some kind, this would help us participate in the therapy. And then the other thing we were interested in was actually, of course, as we were all interested in, whilst we're interested in quality of life and communication, we know that we need to make sure that the interventions we're delivering value for money. But could they even could there be cost savings more broadly in terms of quality of life and also our National Health Service? So to help us think about what to measure, we thought we'd go back to the drawing boards. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is a piece of work that we did internationally. So we actually decided to develop what's called a core outcome set. So we went to 17 countries around the world. And the first thing we did is we asked people with their family and their family members, so people with PPA and their family members, what do you actually most want to change about your lives with PPA? Specifically about how your communication, and the way that PPA affects your life. And we managed to recruit more than 100 people with PPA and around about 100 care partners as well. And we felt this was really useful because we're doing this study in across England and London, and we have quite a diverse community. And so we looked internationally for inspiration, and we want this intervention to be used internationally. So we use consensus methods to do this, and I'm going to show you the results of what people told us. People told us they wanted to be able to participate in conversations with family and friends. That was the most important thing they wanted to change about their lives, and we needed to measure that. They wanted us to be able to measure conversations with family and friends, okay? People also spoke about being able to get their words out, being more fluent, conveying messages by any means, and understanding what others were saying in conversations. But actually, it was very reassuring to us that actually that primary measure I mentioned, the goal setting and the conversation behaviors, they were the things that they wanted to change. But actually, they wanted to change those in the context of interactions with family and friends, not just the person they were doing this therapy with, but also more broadly. So we then took this data to a wider group of researchers internationally in the PPA world to try and identify the measure we should use. The long story short is that we weren't able to agree on a measure internationally that really measures this construct. So that still left us with a few, made the situation a bit more tricky. So what we're currently doing, we're actually in the middle of a new study, and we're trialing several different measures on top of the video recordings and the goal setting. We're trying a variety of discourse measures that explore people's relationships and confidence in conversations. We're also looking at the amount of therapy we deliver, as I mentioned. We're looking at whether we've checked, rather than focusing on 4 sessions, we're looking at 4 stages. And this intervention is being delivered over 2 to 6 sessions, depending on when people manage to achieve their goals by, in actual fact. We're also we've refined the intervention to be delivered remotely via Zoom. So we're in the middle of our trial now. We're looking at it, we're delivering it via Zoom, and we're comparing our results to the results we got from in-person interventions. We also decided strategically that it might be useful to explore this intervention, the impact of this intervention, not just for people with PPA, but also other rare dementias. We found that the local speech therapists had involved in our original study were being referred people with PPA quite late on in their disease journey. So we started recruiting people much earlier, not just people with PPA, but also these people with posterior cortical atrophy and more typical Alzheimer's disease and young onset AD. And we're recruiting them straight from memory clinics, in actual fact. We thought we'd only get referred people with other rare dementias, and that's how we designed the study. But actually, we've been referred people with all different types of dementia for this study. So just to give you a little sneak peek into the results of our current pilot study. So we're currently piloting our Better Conversations for Primary Progressive Aphasia and Other Rare Dementias. We're piloting it across two NHS trusts in the UK, one of which is a bit more of a national service. And so we're recruiting people from all over the UK. We've really been able to recruit a much more diverse sample because we're embedding it in the National Health Service. So we have several bilingual participants, people from various demographic backgrounds and occupational backgrounds, people from in different types of relationships, so parent-child, so adult children. We have different types of ethnic backgrounds as well, people in rural areas, people in urban areas. We've got more care partners. We have had only very small number of people who haven't been able to participate, and actually they're the people who they're not been able to participate because there literally isn't any partner around so these are often people who are living alone, who don't have any family. So that's a much smaller number in this study than in our previous study, which is leading us to think about, well, maybe then we need to also be designing interventions where we find communication and care partners for conversation for people. So there might be these kind of bespoke interventions we need to think about for these people who haven't got anyone to talk to. There are only a very small number of people who haven't liked the technology. So a very, very small number of people who haven't participated due to the remote delivery. And some of those people who didn't like the technology have been people with more behavioural-led dementias who haven't been able to engage with the technology or the people via technology. And then a couple of the people who haven't liked the technology have been actually the partners who just have found it too stressful. But it's been a very small number. In terms of intervention sessions, we actually have a real diversity. There's been some people who've only used about 3 sessions and some people who've used more like 5 or 6 sessions. And we're finding that in some cases, people are explicitly stating to us, if I can have 6 sessions, I'll take 6 sessions because it's really hard to get any speech therapy. They're wanting the whole lot, not because of they've achieved their goals. They don't want to stop because they've achieved their goals. They just want to do as much as they can because they can't access anything. So it is possible that actually a small dose goes a really long way in terms of gains. We're following people up 3 months later. And one of the interviews I did, we're threading through an implementation arm, and I was doing an implementation interview about 3.5 months after they'd actually started in our study, and several of those people have said these are strategies that have stayed with us. They've been a lifeline. One person said to me, I've never been a practice person. I was never going to engage in practice, but this has been just what I needed. Strategies for real life conversations. So our feeling is that we're on the right track. some of the measures we're using, we're not necessarily, the relationship measures, it's yet to be seen what the outcomes are like. So watch this space is my answer to that. I also wanted to draw your attention, actually, and I think this is really interesting because all of the work we did, we've been doing alongside, I kept mentioning that I have co-produced these interventions with what we call a patient and public involvement group. And we have a Better Conversations patient and public involvement advisory group who have advised me along my journey. And one of the things they said to me at the end of our first trial, they said to me, look, it's all lovely. It's all great and lovely that you develop these interventions with us. They're great interventions. But do you know what? Getting to speech therapy is really hard. Loads of people have never heard of PPA. Loads of health professionals have never heard of PPA. Loads of health professionals don't know what speech and language therapists can do for people with primary progressive aphasia. You need to actually also design awareness campaigns to raise awareness of primary progressive aphasia. So one of the things we did alongside our last, so that the Better Conversations with PPA and other rare dementias, is we've also designed a primary progressive awareness campaign, progressive aphasia awareness campaign. We're in the second year of that campaign. And I've been collaborating in the UK with Rosemary Townsend, who's runs a charity, the only speech therapy charity in the UK that support people with PPA. And the photo I've got up here, I thought you guys might find it quite interesting. This is actually in the Houses of Parliament in England. So we were in the Houses of Parliament about 5 weeks ago, and we took 32 people so families, members, and people with PPA into the Houses of Parliament. They're all sat here. And right at the back here, we also collaborated with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. And we managed to get 13 MPs to come into this meeting we had and to listen to Rosemary and I say something, but actually most importantly, a gentleman, Michael Petley, who has primary progressive aphasia, and he's been video recorded and he's all over the internet talking about his experiences. And as a consequence, we've had 16 questions in the House of Lords and the Houses of Parliament, so combined, asking about speech therapy provision, so challenging the government on their speech and language therapy provision for primary progressive aphasia.
Wait, who said that? Oh my God.
Yeah. I think someone's accidentally turned their phone on. Hi, Karen. There we go. So the other, and the reason I'm mentioning this as well, so we had, this is also a collaboration across 13 countries around the world. And there was a primary progressive aphasia awareness event on the 10th of April, a webinar in the UK. There was also a webinar held in the United States. There was also a webinar held in Greece, Italy, Brazil, Australia, France. I'm getting all my countries now. Brussels, Switzerland, Germany, maybe, and Norway. There were events held across lots of countries around the world as part of our international SLT/P PPA network. And those awareness webinars have all been video recorded from last year in 2025, and they're on our website, our international website, and the 2026 webinars will be on our website again. So if you ever come across a person with primary progressive aphasia, this is a really wonderful resource. So the webinar talks about the role of speech and language therapy. We have neurologists talking about what primary progressive aphasia is. We have different professionals talking about different aspects of supporting people with primary progressive aphasia. And then most importantly, across every single webinar around the world, we have people with lived experience conveying their experiences. So I wanted to finish by just mentioning that we have the first ever international conference on primary progressive aphasia happening in July in London. And this is all part of this international collaboration across. We actually now have members, speech and language therapy therapists, academic researchers, clinician, academic speech and language therapy researchers across, and we have more than 20 countries within our network. And we were all motivated not only to spread awareness amongst the kind of clinical and public world, but also amongst the research world, and bring this together to keep moving and driving this research forward. And this is a conference that will be both in person in July, but also remote via video conferencing. And Sharon is, as mentioned, one of our star speakers. She has a platform presentation. So please do sign up if you're interested.